A Trip into the Darkness. Chapter 32. Once she arrived at his bedroom door, she found it cracked. Pushing it open, Mallory stepped inside. His room was dark and masculine. The walls and carpet were deep brown. His bed was huge and covered in black bedding. The furniture was all dark wood, and there was a few lamps scattered around, offering a calming light. His scent was so strong inside of the large room, and it made her mouth hurt. Behind his bed were two big windows that looked out into the woods, which were located behind the house. She stared at the trees and wondered why he would pick the one room in the house that didn't have a view of the ocean. His energy encircled around her body, making her tingle as she stood in his doorway. Licking her lips, she moved to his bed and sat down on the edge to wait for him. She wondered if he knew she was here yet, and assumed he probably did. The shower turned off behind the white door to the bathroom, and Mallory's heart started to beat faster. What if he rejected her? She wanted to run out of his room, but she wasn't a coward. When the door opened and she found him standing there with nothing but a towel around his hips, she hoped her coming to his room tonight wasn't a mistake. "Mallory, are you okay?" Andres asked her as his eyes took her in. She could already see his length pushing against the towel. She bit her lip as she imagined touching him there. "Do you think I'm a monster?" It was a simple question that had been eating her alive since last night. He had read her journal, and the things she had written about were graphic and disgusting. A frown pulled at his beautiful face as he cocked his head to the side in a sign of confusion. Little droplets of water clung to his black beard, and she wanted to go to him so she could lick the droplets away. "A monster? Of course not. I think you're gorgeous and intelligent and brave, but not a monster." Standing up from the bed, she took a step towards him and asked, "Do you want me?" She feared his answer. If he told her no, it was going to take a lot for her not to run out of his room, crying like a rejected little girl. "Yes. I've wanted you since the moment you sunk your sharp, pretty teeth into my neck on the plain, and I've continued to want you ever since," he rasped. His eyes traveled up and down her body, which was proudly on display in the little dress she had on. Mallory's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected that answer. She had looked like a hideous mess on the plain, and had been savage when she attacked his throat. His energy spiked when she told him. "Then take me, Andreas." It was the first time she had spoken his full first name, and it made her feel powerful and giddy. Meeting her eyes, he began to walk towards her. When he was less than a foot away, he stopped, and one of his hands went to her hair, tilting her head back so she looked up at him. Even in her heels, he stood taller than she. Leaning down, he kissed her, and butterflies exploded in her tummy. It was a soft and gentle kiss at first, but as Mallory kissed him back, the intensity increased. Her hands traveled up his chest, and she gripped his strong shoulders as her nails lightly dug into his flesh. His hand, which wasn't in her hair, slid down the front of her dress to her breast. He caressed her through the thin material. Then his gentle touch turned slightly aggressive as he grabbed and gently rolled her nipple in between his fingers. Mallory pressed herself harder into his body as pleasure and warmth spread through her. When she whimpered from the pressure on her aching nipple, he released the nub and went to the other breast to massage it with his large hand. Moving her hand down the front of his body, she pulled at the towel that was still wrapped around his hips. After one good tug, the thing came free. Reaching, she wrapped her hand around his long, hard dick. It was perfect, and she wanted it inside of her, that instant. The hand in her hair left and moved down her backside. She felt him grab her ass and squeeze before he released it and smacked it. Mallory rocked her hips at the sensation while she continued to explore his cock with her hand. Slowly stroking his proud length, she could feel pre-cum seeping out of the tip. His mouth was still on hers, and their tongues danced together, swirling around and making her feel lightheaded as she struggled to breathe. His kiss was setting her on fire, and she practically tasted his fierce energy. Andres moved his hand from her ass to the front of her dress, then dragged his fingers up her thigh until they were touching her aching, wet pussy. Andres broke away from their kiss to look her in the eyes. He rubbed her sensitive flesh, Slowly, he sunk his fingers deep into her folds, lightly penetrating her entrance. Mallory was panting as he worked one of his long fingers inside of her. He was driving her crazy with his light petting and probing. She quickly felt herself building until he removed his middle finger from her. Using both of his hands, he grabbed the bottom of her dress, pulling it over her head before dropping it on the floor. He took a small step back from her and let his eyes roam over her naked form. I love that you never wear a bra. You should never trap these away with a restriction, he told her as he lowered his mouth to one of her nipples and started suckling her. Moaning, her hands went to his hair as she held him to her, pulling at the silky, damp locks. She could feel her claws lengthening from her intense desire. When she was panting, she pushed his head away from her breast and pulled his face back to hers so she could kiss him again. Bringing her hands to his chest, she pushed him back towards the bed. Once his legs brushed the frame, she shoved his chest to make him sit. Sitting on the bed, he looked up at her. Falling to her knees, she pushed his legs open to give herself more access to his hard dick. Parting her lips, she licked his shaft, working her tongue from the base to the tip. Then she took the whole length in her mouth. She wrapped her lips around him. She heard him hiss and felt his hands in her hair as she sucked him. He panted. Mi divina, Mallory, you drive me crazy. She slobbered all over his long, thick length, and her mouth started to throb. She felt her teeth lengthening, and she was overcome with the intense desire to bite him. Come here, baby girl, Andres told her as he reached down and grabbed her arms to pull her on top of him. Perched on top of him, he flipped her over onto her back, then kissed her neck before dragging his tongue along her skin and down her breast. Mallory arched her back in hopes that it would encourage him to keep suckling on her nipples. Kissing both of them, he dragged his tongue down her stomach before putting his hands on the inside of her thighs, spreading her wide for him. He kissed the inside of her legs and worked his way up to her aching flesh. Licking all through her folds, he slid a long finger inside of her before sucking hard on her aching clit. Arching off a bed, an orgasm tore through her body, and she screamed his name, riding the waves of pleasures while he continued to feast on her flesh. When she came down from her high, she was panting and her mouth was throbbing and aching. Andres, please, she cried out as he licked her. Looking up from between her legs, he met her eyes. He must have realized what she needed because he crawled back up her body, kissing a path across her face before he moved his head to the side, giving her access to his throat. Mallory's instincts kicked in, and she leaned up to latch onto his lower neck, close to his shoulder. His blood flowed into her mouth while she wrapped her arms around his neck and brought her other hand up to pet his chest. His taste was everything she had ever dreamed of and made her feel strong and lightheaded. His blood was the most intense and beautiful high she'd ever experienced. Mixing his blood with sex took Mallory to a different dimension, and she felt like she was flying high in the sky. That's it, my sweet girl. Take your fill, baby. I love it when you feed from me, Andres whispered as she pulled at the wound in his neck. Mallory spread her legs and waited for him to enter, but an image of Troy flashed through her mind, causing her to jerk and release his throat. Closing her eyes, she tried not to think as her chest became tight and her breath shallow. Andres's hand touched her face, and she could feel his calm and warm energy seeping into her before he whispered, Look at me, Blue Eyes. Mallory opened her eyes and stared into his golden brown gaze. His amber eyes almost looked like they were glowing in the dim light, and she wondered if it was possible for eyes to glow. Leaning down, he lightly kissed her lips before he flipped them over so he was the one underneath. Sitting on top of him, her chest released, and she felt more in control. Leaning down, she kissed him again before moving her body down to his hips. Andres' dick was hard, standing up tall and proud. Using her hand, she pushed his dick down towards his stomach so she could back herself onto him. As she slowly pushed herself down on his length, she could feel him stretching her in the most perfect way. Andres' hands were on her hips. When he was almost all the way in, she could feel the long length brushing up against the back inside wall of her vagina. Biting her lips, she tried to push herself down further, and her breath left her in a rush of pleasure that coursed through her body. My God, Mallory, you feel so fucking good and tight around my cock. Yes, Mallory moaned as she started to ride him. Andres used his hands on her hips to help her move up and down on top of him. Looking down, she could see the strain as he held himself back. Muscles and tendons were pulled tight in his neck as she moved on top of him. Falling onto his chest, she kissed his full lips and increased her pace. His dick filled her as she rode him, and she could feel his length bumping up against her cervix. Her body started to constrict around Andres' length, and she quickly rode out her next orgasm. Yelling in pleasure, she moved faster on top of him, her inner muscles constricting and her world turning black. Time passed in bliss before she seemed to come back to her body, and she touched her forehead to his. With a smile, she kissed his beautiful face. Then he started to move underneath her, lifting her limp body as he fucked her hard from underneath. As his pace increased, Mallory panted. Yes, yes, I love this, Andres. Please keep fucking me, she cried out as her body worked its way towards another release. Andres slammed his dick deeper within. She felt him hit the back wall inside of her, and pleasure and pain rocketed through her system, pushing her over the edge. Andres yelled out her name as his body shook, and he pushed himself as deep inside of her pussy as he could go. Mallory sat on top of him. She could feel her legs shaking from the extreme pleasure she had just received. With a sigh, she let herself fall back onto his chest and rested her cheek on his shoulder. His hands moved up from her hips and started rubbing her back. She could feel his long thumbs moving in circles as he dragged his hands up and down her spine. Mallory closed her eyes and felt more at peace than at any other moment in her life. With her eyes closed, she thought about their fleeting time together and how he had stimulated her mind and body in a way no one else ever had. She felt a connection with this man, and she found herself in no hurry to move away from him. Andres, she whispered his name as he continued to hold and pet her. Yes, baby girl. Why is your bedroom the only room in the house that doesn't have a view of the ocean? She asked him because she wanted to know one last detail about him before she left him forever. I grew up around the ocean and have traveled upon its depths all of my life. It is full of life, but it's chaotic, always changing between moods. The forest is peaceful and calm. There's something stable about the trees and how they are grounded. Mallory thought about his response and found herself agreeing with his logic. She had always craved stability and calmness in her life. She had worked so hard to try and create a life where she could support herself and find her peace. In a way, she had grown up in chaos because of her mom and how much they moved around, never stopping, never finding harmony, never feeling grounded. She wondered if she could have stayed with Andres if he would have became her forest. Mallory wished things would have been different, and that she could stay nestled away in his room with Andres until the end of time. Unfortunately, like everything good in life, it had come to an end. Mallory rolled off his body and felt his semi-hard length leave her. Standing up, she walked over to her dress that had been discarded on the floor and laid down to pick it up. She still had on her heels, and she felt like she might fall over as she stood back up. Pulling on the dress, she felt Andres touch her shoulders. Closing her eyes, she leaned her back into his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and laid his cheek on top of her head. Do you think I might get pregnant? She asked him, as dread sunk in that they had just slept together without protection. She didn't have a doubt that his babies would be beautiful, but there was no way she could protect a child on the run. Then there was the issue of her starving from lack of immortal blood, and that wouldn't be good for a fetus. It would be nearly impossible for you to get pregnant this early in your immortality. As a young changeling, your body is still acclimating, and it could take decades before you become fertile again. Even then, it's rare for a changeling to become and remain pregnant. Nature has ensured immortal reproduction to be very difficult, he told her as his arms tightened slightly around her frame. She felt a moment of sadness that there wasn't even a possibility of carrying his baby. She would never want to put a child through a life on the run, but the idea of having a part of him years later would have been nice. Nodding her head, feeling a loss deep inside of her soul, she said, We should go. I'm sure dinner is getting cold. Will you stay with me while I get dressed? He asked, and she wanted nothing more than to not have to leave him, but she had something she needed to do. I want to go change into something more appropriate. I'll meet you in the kitchen. And with that, she broke away from his embrace, leaving his room and him behind. Going up the stairs, she concentrated on calming her breath. That was by far the best sex she had had in her entire life. He was perfect and fit into her body like they were molded for each other. Walking into her room, she tried to feel happy that she had gotten to have him at least once. However, all she felt was regret for all the times that she would miss him when she was gone. Kicking off her shoes and pulling off the dress, she hurried to pull on a t-shirt and a pair of jeans. Walking over to her backpack, she unzipped it and dug inside for the pack of smokes she had stashed in a side pocket. Pulling them out, she opened the top of the box and saw the little glass vial that she had hidden inside. She had gotten the vial from the same drug dealer that had given her the heroin pills. He had called it Sweet Dream because just a drop would knock a person out for hours. She remembered what Andres had called her his sweet dream, and she wanted to laugh at the irony. Mallory had only tried this drug once. She had poured a few drops into a water bottle and drank it. She hadn't tasted anything and had assumed the drug dealer had been full of crap until she woke up later that day on the floor. She had decided she had no reason to take something that would just make her pass out, but she had kept it just in case. There were 2 cigarettes left in the box with the vial. Slipping the pack into her pocket, along with a lighter, Mallory made her way downstairs to have one last meal with him before she left.